First of all, just want to thank you guys for all the support. I noticed earlier today that we're actually at 250 subscribers. So we're a quarter of the way to 1,000, which is pretty crazy to think about, given we've only been at this for a few months. Also, I just want to apologize. We are taking care of my mother-in-law's cat, so if you happen to hear some noises in the background, hopefully it'll be drowned out by the campfire, but just wanted to acknowledge that. Last week we read about a chapter, I think a whole chapter of The Hobbit, but today, since we've had to cut back a little bit to just Mondays, I'm going to kind of be in rotation between a few books. And besides The Hobbit, the next one that I've chosen is Tales of Norse Mythology by Helen A. Gerber. And part of the reason I chose it is because we're already pretty decent way into the book. And also, you guys really seem to enjoy it. Pretty much without fail, every week or so I'll have someone ask, when the next Norse mythology book is coming, or video is coming, so it is now. Next week I will be doing the Iliad, but for now, let's dive straight in. So, last we left off, we had just started the chapter about Thor. I think we were only just a couple pages in. And we learned that he is called the Thunderer. We learned a couple of different names of his. Had this interesting photo of a statue of the hammer bearer. And I think we learned a little bit about his hammer and also his belt. The hammer, of course, is Mjolnir, and I can't remember the name of the belt. I'm seeing if it's in here. Okay, he had an iron gauntlet called Jarngriper, which I guess is kind of like iron grip. There it is. A magic belt called Megingjord. But today, we're going to start with Thors Family. Thor was twice married. First to the giantess Jarnsaxa, which is Ironstone, who bore him two sons, Magni, which is strength, and Modi, which is courage. Both destined to survive their father and the twilight of the gods and rule over the new world, which was to rise like a phoenix from the ashes of the first. His second wife was Sif, the golden-haired, who also bore him two children, Loride, and a daughter named Thrud, a young giantess renowned for her size and strength. True to the well-known affinity of contrast, Thrud was wooed by the dwarf Alvis, whom she rather favored, and one evening when this suitor, who being a dwarf could not face the light of day, presented himself in Asgard to sue for her hand, the assembled gods did not refuse their consent. They had scarcely signified their approbation, however, when Thor, who had been absent, suddenly appeared, and casting a glance of contempt upon the puny lover, declared he would have to prove that his knowledge atoned for his small stature before he could win his bride. To test Alvis's mental powers, Thor then questioned him in the language of the gods, Vanas, elves, and dwarfs, artfully prolonging his examination until sunrise, when the first beam of light falling upon the unhappy dwarf petrified him. And I think in this case petrified means turned him to stone. There he stood, an enduring example of the god's power, to serve as a warning to all other dwarves who might dare to test it. Ne'er in human bosom have I found so many words of the old time. Thee with subtlest cunning have I yet befooled. Above ground standeth thou, dwarf, by day art overtaken, bright sunshine fills the hall. Sif, the golden-haired. Sif, Thor's wife, was very vain of a magnificent head of long golden hair which covered her from head to foot like a brilliant veil, and as she too was a symbol of the earth, her hair was said to represent the long grass or the golden grain covering the northern harvest fields. Thor was very proud of his wife's beautiful hair. Imagine his dismay, therefore, upon waking one morning to find her shorn and as bald and denuded of ornament as the earth when the grain has been garnered and nothing but the stubble remains. In his anger, Thor sprang to his feet, vowing he would punish the perpetrator of this outrage, whom he immediately and rightly conjectured to be Loki, the arch plotter, ever on the lookout for some evil deed to perform. Seizing his hammer, Thor went in search of Loki, who attempted to evade the irate god by changing his form, but it was all to no purpose. Thor soon overtook him, and without more ado caught him by the throat and almost strangled him ere he yielded to his imploring signs and relaxed his powerful grip. When he could draw his breath, Loki begged forgiveness, but all his entreaties were vain until he promised to procure for Sif a new head of hair as beautiful as the first and as luxuriant in growth. And thence for Sif new tresses I'll bring of gold ere the daylight's gone, so that she shall liken a field in spring with its yellow flowered garment on. Then Thor consented to let the traitor go, so Loki rapidly crept down into the bowels of the earth, where Svartalfaheim was situated, to beg the dwarf Dwalin to fashion. That's actually funny, I want to pause there. This dwarf, Dwalin, which might be pronounced Dwalin, is really, really similar, or actually maybe even identical, to the name of one of the dwarves in The Hobbit. I'm pretty sure one of the dwarves is named Dwalin. Anyway, he went down to Svartalfaheim to beg the dwarf Dwalin to fashion not only the precious hair, but a present for Odin and Frey, whose anger he wished to disarm. His request was favorably received, and the dwarf fashioned the spear Gungnir, which never failed in its aim, and the ship Skidbladnir, which always, wafted by favorable winds, could sail through the air as well as on the water, and which had this further magic property, that although it could contain the gods and all their steeds, it could be folded up into the very smallest compass and thrust in one's pocket. Lastly, he spun the finest golden thread, from which he fashioned the hair required for Sif, declaring that as soon as it touched her head, it would grow fast there and become as her own. Though they now seem dead, let them touch but her head, each hair shall the life moisture fill, nor shall malice nor spell henceforward prevail Sif's tresses to work aught of ill. Loki was so pleased with these proofs of the dwarf's skill that he declared the son of Evald to be the most clever of smiths, words which were overheard by Brock, another dwarf, who exclaimed what he was sure his brother Sindri could produce 3 objects which would surpass those which Loki held, not only in intrinsic value, but also in magical properties. Loki immediately challenged the dwarf to show his skill, wagering his head against Brock's on the result of the undertaking. Sindri, apprised of the wager, accepted Brock's offer to blow that bellows, warning him, however, that he must work persistently and not for a moment relax his efforts if he wished him to succeed. Then he threw some gold in the fire and went out to bespeak the favor of the hidden powers. During his absence, Brock diligently plied the bellows, while Loki, hoping to make him pause, changed himself into a gadfly and cruelly stung his hand. In spite of the pain, the dwarf kept on blowing, and when Sindri returned, he drew out the fire an enormous wild boar called Gullinbursti, because of its golden bristles, which had the power of radiating light as it flitted across the sky, for it could travel through the air with marvelous velocity. And now, strange to tell, from the roaring fire came the golden-haired Gullinburst, or Burst perhaps, to serve as the charger, the sun god Frey, sure of all wild boars, this the first. This first piece of work successfully completed, Sindri flung some more gold on the fire and bade his brother resume blowing, while he again went out to secure magic assistance. This time, Loki, still disguised as a gadfly, stung the dwarf on his cheek, but in spite of the pain, Brock worked on, and Sindri returned. He triumphantly drew out of the flames the magic ring Draupnir, the emblem of fertility, from which 8 similar rings dropped every 9th night. They worked it and turned it with wondrous skill, till they gave it the virtue rare, that each thrice 3rd night from its rim there fell 8 rings as their parent fair. Before we turn the page here, this is a photo, I guess, of Sif specifically, and maybe Thor in the background here. Yeah, she's got some really long hair. Now a lump of iron was cast in the flames, and with renewed caution not to forfeit their success by inattention, Sindri passed out, leaving Brock to ply the bellows as before. Loki was now in desperation, and he prepared for a final effort. This time, still in the guise of a gadfly, he stung the dwarf above the eye until the blood began to flow in such a stream that it prevented his seeing what he was doing. Hastily raising his hand for a second, Brock dashed aside the stream of blood, but short as was the interruption, it had worked irreparable harm, and when Sindri drew his work out of the fire, he uttered an exclamation of disappointment, for the hammer he had fashioned was short in the handle. Then the dwarf raised his hand to his brow for the smart, ere the iron well out was beat, and they found that the haft by an inch was too short, but to alter it then 'twas too late. Notwithstanding this mishap, Brock was sure of winning the wager, and he did not hesitate to present himself before the gods in Asgard, where he gave Odin the ring Draupnir, Frey the boar Gullinbursti, and Thor the hammer Mjolnir, whose power none could resist. Loki, in turn, gave the spear Gungnir to Odin, the ship Skidbladnir to Frey, and the golden hair to Thor. But although the latter immediately grew upon Sif's head and was unanimously declared more beautiful than her own locks had ever been, the gods decreed Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm gonna have to edit that out or not. I had to sneeze. The gods decreed that Brock had won the wager on the ground, that the hammer Mjolnir in Thor's hands would prove invaluable against the frost giants on the last day. And at their head came Thor, shouldering his hammer, which the giants know. In order to save his head, Loki fled precipitately, but was overtaken by Thor, who brought him back and handed him over to Brock, telling him, however, that although Loki's head was rightfully his, he must not touch his neck. Hindered from obtaining full vengeance, the dwarf determined to punish Loki by sewing his lips together, and his sword would not pierce them. He borrowed his brothers all for the purpose. However, Loki, after enduring the gods' jibes in silence for a little while, managed to cut the string, and soon after was as loquacious as ever. In spite of his redoubtable hammer, Thor was not held in dread as the injurious god of the storm, who destroyed peaceful homesteads and ruined the harvest by sudden hailstorms and cloudbursts. The Northmen fancied he hurled it only against ice giants and rocky walls, reducing the latter to powder to fertilize the earth and make it yield plentiful fruit to the tillers of the soil. In Germany, where the eastern storms are always cold and blighting, while the western brings warm rains and mild weather, Thor was supposed to journey always from west to east to wage war against the evil spirits, which would fain have enveloped the country in impenetrable veils of mist and have bound it in icy fetters. Thor's journey to Jotunheim. As the giants from Jotunheim were continually sending out cold blasts of wind to nip the tender buds and hinder the growth of the flowers, Thor once made up his mind to go and force them to behave better. Accompanied by Loki, he set out in his chariot, and after riding for a whole day, the gods came at nightfall to the confines of the giant world, where, seeing a peasant's hut, they resolved to stay for rest and refreshment. Their host was hospitable, but very poor, and Thor, seeing that he would scarcely be able to supply the necessary food to satisfy his by no means small appetite, slew both his goats, which he cooked and made ready to eat, inviting his host and family to partake freely of the food thus provided, but cautioning them to throw all the bones without breaking them into the skins of the goats where he had spread out on the floor. The peasant and his family ate heartily, but his son, Thialfi, encouraged by mischievous Loki, ventured to break one of the bones and suck out the marrow, thinking his disobedience would not be detected. On the morrow, however, Thor, ready to depart, struck the goat skins with his hammer, Mjolnir, and immediately the goats sprang up as lively as before, except that one seemed somewhat lame. Perceiving that his commands had been disregarded, Thor would have slain the whole family in his wrath. The culprit acknowledged his fault, however, and the peasant offered to compensate for the loss by giving the irate god not only his son Thialfi, but also his daughter Roskva to serve him forever, charging the man to take good care of the goats, which he left there until he should return, and bidding the young peasants accompany him. Thor now set out on foot with Loki, and after walking all day found himself at nightfall in a bleak and barren country, which was enveloped in an almost impenetrable gray mist. After seeking for some time, Thor saw through the fog the uncertain outline of what looked like a strangely shaped house. Its open portal was so wide and high that it seemed to take up all one side of the house. Entering and finding neither fire nor light, Thor and his companions flung themselves wearily down on the floor to sleep, but were soon disturbed by a peculiar noise and a prolonged trembling of the ground beneath them. Fearing lest the main roof should fall during the earthquake, Thor and his companions took refuge in a wing of the building, where they soon fell sound asleep. At dawn, the god and his companions passed out, but they had not gone very far ere they saw the recumbent form of a sleeping giant, and perceived that the peculiar sound which had disturbed their rest were produced by his snores. At that moment the giant awoke, arose, stretched himself, looked about him for his missing property, and a second later picked up the object which Thor and his companions had mistaken in the darkness for a house. They then perceived with amazement that this was nothing more than a huge mitten, and that the wing in which they had all slept was the separate place for the giant's great thumb. Learning that Thor and his companions were on their way to Utgard, as the giant's realm was also called, Skrimir, the giant, proposed to be their guide, and after walking with them all day, he brought them at nightfall to a spot where he proposed to rest. Ere he composed himself for sleep, however, he offered them the provisions in his wallet, but in spite of strenuous efforts, neither Thor nor his companions could unfasten the knots which Skrimir had tied. Skrimir's thongs seemed to thee hard, when at the food thou couldst not get, when in full health of hunger dying. Utgard Loki. Angry because of his snoring which kept him awake, Thor thrice dealt him fearful blows with his hammer. These strokes, instead of annihilating the monster, merely evoked sleepy comments to the effect that a leaf, a bit of bark, or a twig from a bird's nest overhead had fallen upon his face. Early on the morrow, Skrimir left Thor and his companions, pointing out the shortest road to Utgard Loki's castle, which was built of great ice blocks, with huge glittering icicles as pillars. The gods, slipping between the bars of the great gate, presented themselves boldly before the king of the giants, Utgard Loki, who, recognizing them, immediately pretended to be greatly surprised at their small size, and expressed a wish to see for himself what they could do, as he had often heard their prowess vaunted. Loki, who had fasted longer than he wished, immediately declared he was ready to eat for a wager with anyone. So the king ordered a great wooden trough full of meat to be brought into the hall, and placing Loki one end and his cook Logi at the other, he bade them see which would win. Although Loki did wonders and soon reached the middle of the trough, he found that whereas he had picked the bones clean, his opponent had devoured both them and the trough. Smiling contemptuously, Utgard Loki said that it was evident they could not do much in the eating line, and this so nettled Thor that he declared if Loki could not eat like the voracious cook, he felt confident he could drain the biggest vessel in the house. Such was his unquenchable thirst. Immediately a horn was brought in, and Utgard Loki, declaring that good drinkers emptied it at one draught, moderately thirsty persons at 2, and small drinkers at 3. Thor applied his lips to the rim, but although he drank so deep that he thought he would burst, the liquid still came almost up to the rim when he raised his head. A second and third attempt to empty his thorn proved equally unsuccessful. Thialfi then offered to run a race, but a young fellow named Hugi, who was matched against him, soon outstripped him, although Thialfi ran remarkably fast. Thor proposed next to show his strength by lifting weights, and was challenged to pick up the giant's cat. Seizing an opportunity to tighten his belt Megingjord, which greatly enhanced his strength, he tugged and strained, but was able only to raise one of its paws from the floor. Strong is great Thor, no doubt, when Megan Garther he braces tightly o'er his rock-firm loins. Wow, that is quite the sentence. His rock-firm loins. A last attempt on his part to wrestle with Utgard Loki's old nurse, Ellie, the only opponent deemed worthy of such a puny fellow, ended just as disastrously, and the gods, acknowledging they were beaten, were hospitably entertained. On the morrow they were escorted to the confines of Utgard, where the giant politely informed them that he hoped they would never call upon him again, as he had been forced to employ magic against them. He then went on to explain that he was the giant Skrymir, and that had he not taken the precaution to interpose a mountain between his head and Thor's blows, while he seemingly lay asleep, he would have been slain, as deep clefts in the mountainside to which he pointed testified to the god's strength. Next, he informed them that Loki's opponent was Logi Wildfire, that Thialfi had run a race with Hugi Thought, than which no swifter runner exists, that Thor's drinking horn was connected with the ocean, where his deep draughts had produced a perceptible ebb, that the cat was in reality the terrible Midgard snake encircling the world, which Thor had nearly pulled out of the sea, and that Eli, his nurse, was old age, whom none can resist. Having finished these explanations and cautioned them never to return or he would defend himself by similar delusions, Utgard Loki vanished, and although Thor angrily brandished his hammer and would have destroyed his castle, such a mist enveloped it that it could not be seen, and the thunder god was obliged to return to Thrudvang without having administered his purposed salutary lesson to the race of giants. The full, strong-armed Thor, full oft against Jotunheim did wend, but spite his belt celestial, spite his gauntlets, Utgard Loki still his throne retains, evil itself a force, to force yields never. Odin himself, Thor, and the Hrungnir. Odin himself was once dashing through the air on his 8-footed steed Sleipnir, when he attracted the attention of the giant Hrungnir, who proposed a race, declaring that Golfaxi, his steed, could rival Sleipnir in speed. In the heat of the race, Hrungnir did not notice the direction in which they were going, until in the vain hope of overtaking Odin, he urged his steed to the very gates of Valhalla. Discovering then where he was, the giant grew pale with fear, for he knew he had jeopardized his life by venturing into the stronghold of the gods, his hereditary foes. The Aesir, however, were too honorable to take even an enemy at disadvantage, and instead of doing him harm, they asked him into their banqueting halls, where he proceeded to indulge in liberal potations of the heavenly mead set before him. He soon grew so excited that he began to boast of his power, declaring he would come someday and take possession of Asgard, which he would destroy, together with the gods, save only Freya and Sif, upon whom he gazed with an admiring leer. The gods, knowing he was not responsible, let him talk unmolested, but Thor, coming home just then from one of his journeys and hearing his threat to carry away the beloved Sif, flew into a terrible rage. He furiously brandished his hammer with intent to annihilate the boaster. This the gods would not permit, however, and they quickly threw themselves between the irate thunderer and their guest, imploring Thor to respect the sacred rites of hospitality and not to desecrate their peace instead by shedding blood. Thor was at last induced to bridle his wrath, but he demanded that Hrungnir should appoint a time and place for a holmgang, as a northern duel was generally called. Thus challenged, Hrungnir promised to meet Thor at Utgard, the confines of his realm, 3 days later, and departed somewhat sobered by the fright he had experienced. When his fellow giants heard how rash he had been, they chided him sorely, but they took counsel together in order to make the best of a bad situation. Hrungnir told them that he was to have the privilege of being accompanied by a squire, whom Thialfi would engage in fight. Wherefore they proceeded to construct a creature of clay 9 miles long and proportionately wide, whom they called Mokurkjalfi, or Mist Waiter. As they could find no human heart big enough to put in this monster's breast, they secured that of a mare, which, however, kept fluttering and quivering with apprehension. The day of the duel arrived. Hrungnir and his squire were on the ground awaiting the arrival of their respective opponents. The giant had not only a flint heart and skull, but also a shield and club of the same substance, and therefore deemed himself well nigh invincible. Thialfi came before his master, and soon after there was a terrible rumbling and shaking which made the giant apprehensive that his enemy would come up through the ground and attack him from underneath. He therefore followed a hint from Thialfi and stood upon his shield. A moment later he saw his mistake, for while Thialfi attacked Mokurkjalfi with a spade, Thor came with a rush upon the scene and flung his hammer full at his opponent's head. Hrungnir, to ward off the blow, interposed his stone club, which was shivered into pieces that flew all over the earth, supplying all the flint stones thereafter to be found. And one fragment sank deep into Thor's forehead. As the god dropped fainting to the ground, his hammer crashed against the head of Hrungnir, who fell dead beside him in such a position that one of his ponderous legs was thrown over the recumbent god. Thou now remindest me how I with Hrungnir fought, that stout heart Jotun, whose head was all of stone, yet I made him fall and sink before me. Thialfi, who in the meanwhile had disposed of the great clay giant with its cowardly mare's heart, now rushed to his master's assistance, but his efforts were unavailing, nor could the other gods whom he quickly summoned raise the pinioning leg. While they were standing there, helplessly wondering what they should do next, Thor's little son, Magni, came up. According to varying accounts, he was then only 3 days or 3 years old, but he quickly seized the giant's foot and unaided set his father free, declaring that had he only been summoned sooner, he would easily have disposed of both giant and squire. This exhibition of strength made the gods marvel greatly, and helped them to recognize the truth of the various predictions, which one and all declared that their descendants would be mightier than they, would survive them, and would rule in their turn over the new heaven and earth. To reward his son for his timely aid, Thor gave him the steed Gulfaxi, to which he had fallen heir by right of conquest, and Magni ever after rode this marvelous horse, which almost equaled the renowned Sleipnir in speed and endurance. Growa, the sorceress. After vainly trying to remove the stone splinter from his forehead, Thor sadly returned home to Thrudvang, where Sif's loving efforts were equally unsuccessful. She therefore resolved to send for Growa, green-making, a sorceress noted for her skill in medicine and for the efficacy of her spells and incantations. Growa immediately signified her readiness to render every service in her power to the god who had so often benefited her, and solemnly began to recite powerful runes under whose influence Thor felt the stone grow looser and looser. His delight at the prospect of a speedy deliverance made Thor wish to reward the enchantress forthwith, and knowing that nothing could give greater pleasure to a mother than the prospect of seeing a long-lost child, he proceeded to tell her that he had recently crossed the Elevagar, or ice streams, to rescue her little son, Orvandil Germ, from the frost giant's cruel power, and had succeeded in carrying him off in a basket. But as the little rogue would persist in sticking one of his bare toes through a hole in the basket, it had been frostbitten, and Thor, accidentally breaking it off, had flung it up into the sky to shine as a star known in the north as Orvandil's toe. Delighted with these tidings, the prophetess paused in her incantations to express her joy, but having forgotten just where she left off, she was unable to continue her spell, and the flint stone remained embedded in Thor's forehead, where it could never be dislodged. Of course, as Thor's hammer always did him in such good service, it was the most prized of all his possessions, and his dismay was very great when he awoke one morning and found it gone. His cry of anger and disappointment soon brought Loki to his side, and to him Thor confided the secret of his loss, declaring that were the giants to hear of it, they would soon attempt to storm Asgard and destroy the gods. Wroth waxed Thor when his sleep was flown, and he found his trusty hammer gone. He smote his brow, his beard he shook, the son of earth gan round him look. And this the word that he spoke: now listen what I tell thee, Loki, which neither on earth below is known, nor in heaven above, my hammer's gone. And that is where we'll stop tonight. Next time, we will read about Thor and Thrym as Loki tries to find the hammer. Thank you guys so much for joining me. If you like the video, please leave a comment. I really enjoy watching and reading. Not watching. I enjoy reading the comments that come in and discussing with you guys things about stories and mythology. Like the video. And of course, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate the support. Also, click the little bell icon just so that you're notified of every video that I make. The next video will come out next Monday, and it will be the next chapter of the Iliad. Until then, I hope you all have a great rest of your night, and sleep well.